Okay. Right. Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. I'm Colleen Striegel. I'm the Director of Human Resources and Administration at the American Refugee Committee. And our offices are located just up here on the 5th floor. And we are pleased to be sponsoring this event tonight for men. When they called and asked, if we could use the space, and I heard it was Tyler, I said, of course, we would love to do that. Because I've had the pleasure of working with Tyler when he was here at the American Refugee Committee when he was Vice President for International Programs. And I was really excited to be able to introduce him tonight. But then I was told somebody else is introducing him tonight, and kind of thought about it, and so I said, okay, I'll say, okay, thank you for coming, and to tell you how happy we are about sponsoring it. But I just have to get in a couple words just about Tyler, because it was really a pleasure to work with him, and I'll let Brianna go through his background and everything, but I see here tonight there are a number of people from our humanitarian assistance course that we give once a year, and Tyler had done a number of sessions for our Introduction to Humanitarian Assistance course. He did a number of classes, and he consistently got really high super ratings on his courses. So I'm telling you, this is sold out tonight, by the way, and you are really fortunate because you are in for a real treat. He is like, one of his many strengths is his facilitation and presentation skills. And I think you got a taste of that already when he asked like kind of your background. This will be tailor-made to all of you here. And you'll love it. I can't wait to talk to you after it's over because you are in for a really special treat. So I'm going to ask Rhiannon to come up and she'll give you a more formal background on Tyler. Thanks.
Okay, welcome everyone. Today we are privileged to be joined by Tyler Zabriskie for a discussion on leading strategy and change in a culturally complex context. So as you can see on your note on your seat also, Tyler has over 30 years of experience as a leader and practitioner in Africa, Asia, and North America. And currently, Tyler is a principal consultant for Zabriskie Consulting, a leadership, strategy, and organizational development consulting business that works with NGOs, nonprofits, and foundations. And previously, as Colleen said, he served as Senior VP of International Programs at American Refugee Committee and as the Senior Advisor for Change Leadership at World Vision International. So when asked what the most rewarding part of his job, Tyler noted in an interview with Columbia University Center that he really enjoyed working with skilled professionals in solving a problem, which I thought was kind of intriguing. And he said it was great fun when there's a complex problem that we don't know how to solve. And if we get the right people in the room, then we can develop an action plan. I love facilitating that process, seeing the big picture and getting down to the concrete actions. So please join me in welcoming Tyler Zabriskie today as he shares insights from his vast international and domestic experience, engaging in solving all kinds of problems with and within diverse NGO organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for a very gracious introduction. I feel well introduced. Interesting that you picked up that quote from the Columbia interview. This topic tonight is not a simple topic that we're going to just race right through and get down to action plans. Rather it's one of those enormous topics, the kind of things that puzzle us all through our careers. Maybe attracted you to study it or go into it in the first place. How do you cross this massive socioeconomic divide from the wealthiest in the world to the poorest, most isolated, most abused communities and individuals in the world? And I'm not going to have, an easy answer to that. But what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to introduce some frameworks that have been very helpful for me to think about it. They're not the standard approach. I'm not going to go through the standard sequence of a strategy process or the standard sequence of a change leadership process. But I'm going to try to introduce some ideas that might prompt some new thinking and some conversation with us. those of you who have worked in international development and humanitarian relief, worked cross-culturally, and the vast majority of you raised your hand as people who have struggled with really difficult issues of crossing cultural differences and entering different worldviews. And if you are like me, you met with periods of complete bewilderment, certainly culture shock, but other times where you look back at your own culture and you thought, well, what's wrong with my own culture? What's going on here? I can't understand what's going on here. And we get immersed in some of the most difficult differences in the world, so profound, so embedded in culture and religion and economic status, that those worldviews are often incommensurate. It's hard to even compare them. They're so profoundly different. And yet, there's incredible richness and discovery by trying to build bridges between those worlds. And I'm guessing there are a lot of bridge builders in the world, where at some point along your life or your studies, you've kind of gotten a taste for this. That there's something really thrilling about trying to get your head around, your heart around, the way people who are different approach the world. And that there's discovery and transformation that happens as you do. So there are going to be, I'll stop a few points along the way, maybe tell some stories, and I'm sure there'll be many stories that you'll have as well. So I'm going to follow a sequence here. I'm going to start by using an economic framework. As I mentioned, this socioeconomic divide is also a great divide of wealth. So with vast concentrations on one part of the world and very small portions of the wealth of the whole globe in other countries and other communities. So I want to use a tool that came out of business. In fact, I'm going to be borrowing from a book some of you may know of. Have any of you ever encountered the book, The Experience Economy? Does that sound familiar? Okay, that's consistent with my experience. Outside of the tech industry, I spent about 3 years working with an internet startup. This is really unknown. And in fact, I met just 2 weeks ago with one of the authors, Joe Pine, and talked to him about how this model that they've developed applies in the nonprofit world and international development and to foundations. It was completely new to him. They really developed this for thinking about experiences in the high-tech world and in the for-profit world. So I'm going to try to build a bridge between his economic model and how it might shed some light on how we work with beneficiaries and with donor communities. In fact, I think it's quite a powerful model. And then I'm going to take a look at once we've kind of got an economic sense of this divide between the worlds we reach across, I'm going to take a look at some ways of thinking about culture, and I'll propose a fairly simple one. Maybe familiar to you, but generally speaking, it hasn't been when I've talked with groups. But maybe we'll shed some new light on how we think about that difference culturally. And then I'm going to take a look at how our organizations try to sit in between those worlds, sit in between the vastly different cultures, and facilitate transformation on either end. And as you know, all of you have worked in organizations, there are lots of pressures, financial pressures, the culture of your donor, the government culture in which you're operating, both at home and overseas, that create very powerful forces and incentives that may be completely different than the mission you thought you signed up for. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about how we attempt to navigate that problem. Then I'll have a concluding remark from a bit of Greek mythology that maybe you might find interesting. So I'm going to jump in then, and I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to hear Nobel laureate, Peace Laureate Lame Gbowee just this last week. Did any others in the room go? Heather and I both were there, and you're with You Thrive, who sponsored the whole event. She was here in town, and she was asked some questions about what's it like in Liberia when people come in and do international aid. And she gave a little metaphor. Heather, do you remember what she said?
What about the billions?
Well, she gave a metaphor about a house. I'll explain it. You don't have to.
I don't remember that one.
No, okay. She said, well, that's right. It was only in the afternoon one, I think. She said that being in a country where international aid comes in is like owning a house, and someone comes and says, we really want to help you, and they move into your house. And they start moving your furniture around, and they shift things from your bedroom to your living room, and they live in your house. And they live there for 2 years. And 2 years go by and they've not once asked you, what do you want to do with your house? They just keep shifting things around the way they think it makes sense. And then finally, after 2 years, they say, yep, time's up, off we go. And if you move your furniture back to where it was, or you start changing things back, they say, oh gosh, another person who just failed to take advantage of the opportunity. Her analogy, her metaphor is that when you're in a country, aid comes, and even though there's participatory processes to discover what community wants, there are needs assessments. Those of you who've done this work, you know it. You really try hard to do that work well. But there are other things that get in the way, that influence how it's done, or where the emphasis is, or what gets paid attention to, or what gets measured. It ends up being like you're in somebody else's house, and you don't even care to ask them about their own house and what they want. And so there's this profound disconnect, particularly because if you're like me, you really wanted to be doing something that they wanted. You wanted to make that connection. You wanted to hear what was important to them. So, generally speaking, when organizations that are in international development approach this, they start from a perspective of strategy. Now, they will normally start by saying, okay, what's happening in that culture where we want to work? We'll start with a needs assessment. And when we've got a good enough sense, then we sort of approach a strategy process to try to figure out how we bridge that need and all the potential sources of funds. If it's UN, it's different than if it's USAID, or if it's DFID, or if it's individual giving, or if it's a religious-based group of donors, all very different in terms of how they influence what we do. We try to figure that out and ask the question, what should the organization in between be so it can responsibly take those funds and deliver that value, right? The normal processes of strategy are ones I'm sure you all know. You do a strategic planning process and you start with a vision statement, right? How is this organization going to change that outside world? I used to work with World Vision International. World Vision statement says, goodness, life in all its, for every child, life in all its fullness. For every heart, the will to make it so. So they've got this vision of what the world is going to be transformed outside. Then you have a mission statement. Okay, this is what the organization is going to look like in order to deliver that value. And of course, you start with value statements. Okay, so what values are really important to the way we run our culture? You come up with directional goals. So these are the 5 key things we have to be. And then you want smart objectives, right? They're all measurable and specific and realistic. And then you're going to put an action plan in place, right? And then you're going to do project management. Right? You're going to deliver on all that value. Nothing wrong with that, but there's some very significant things that are generally missing. I spoke a little while ago with a colleague who runs the strategy process for a very reputable consulting organization in DC. And a lot of their work is with international agencies. And we were just comparing notes. How do you go about starting strategy? And he laid this out, and it was all well thought out. You know, there's lots of good research about it. I said, well, what I find is if we start that way, what ends up happening is we end up talking to ourselves. Yes, we did have research about, you know, we heard what the Ghanaians said that they wanted, and we heard what the Liberians said, and we heard what the Cambodians said, and we heard all those things, but those are all so different and so specific that we kind of had to figure out, well, what are we going to do? What's our culture going to be across the whole world as an overlay on all these different cultures? And what happens? You talk to your board. You talk to your donors. You talk to your senior staff. You talk to your country directors. You might even put on an event like one I facilitated with 130 of the senior leaders from around the world, every culture, every board chair from every country the organization worked in, and you really kind of wrestle with this stuff. But who's in the conversation? Everybody inside the organization. One of the things that's missing is we have stopped really asking ourselves, what biases do we bring by virtue of our own worldview that might make us miss really important parts of what we do. So I'm going to jump into a model now that talks about the evolution of economic value over time and implies a progression that it might seem a little bit odd to you that I'm introducing this business model, but I'll try to tie it back so it makes sense. All right, so this notion of the progression of economic value starts with agrarian society. Now, in agrarian society, the vast majority of people in the society grow food, right? They're in agriculture, like in Myanmar and Cambodia where I worked, and many countries. I think globally, I think something like 70%, over 70% of the population is still working in agriculture, even though it's very, very tiny, less than 4% in the US, because people need to survive. So what happens in this field is that, excuse me, I can't see that, so what did I just do?
You just went to sleep, maybe?
I don't know, we need Heather. I'll explain the model. Could you see if Heather's around? Maybe she can wake it up again. Let's go to the flip chart. Essentially, you start with commodities in an agrarian society, and eventually, over time, people start taking those commodities and doing what with them? They put them together, they add some value, they come up with goods of some kind. You know, a packaged mix or a manufactured good. They use the commodities to add value to it, and in the process charge a great deal more, right? So it's called a progression. So you make these goods. Now, as you know, you can almost look at the wealth of different nations along just these first two scales. Most developing countries are really commodity economies, and when they're able to produce manufactured goods like many of the Asian countries, they all of a sudden are on a different tier of economic development as a country. The next level after goods, anybody know what the next level is? I bet you do. What's the third level of economy after goods? The service economy, right. So now you went from commodities in an agricultural society, an agrarian society, you went to goods in an industrial society, and the number of people in the West, when we went through that transformation, the number of people working in agriculture dropped dramatically, and the number in industry went up high. And eventually in the US, we added on to those goods with services. So they come with wisdom or advice or consulting to add to what's going on. All right, so here we go. We will probably use that graphic anyway. So in the industrial economy, you make goods. In the service economy, you deliver services. So I want to give an example of.
Heather.
Oh dear, sorry. We must have a loose connection or something.
Oh, did it unconnect now?
Does anybody else have a laptop they want to lend us? And maybe we would want to get this reconfigured. But I'll give an example here. I worked for a while, I mentioned an internet startup that did, it was a supply chain software for perishable goods. And one of my colleagues had grown up on a farm, and he was a really gifted marketer. And maybe 15 years ago, he came up with the idea of rather than selling head lettuce, what he would do is he would mix lettuce from different types of lettuces and sell it as a package. So it was a spring mix. Now nobody else had done this. He was a small operation, and he had a boom year. So what he did is he took a commodity and he customized it. He thought about what the customer needed, and he said, this is what the customer wants to make. I'll make it, save them time. I'll make this service product. But what happened? Well, every grocery store chain around and every producer of food said, well, that's brilliant. We're now going to mass produce it. So in no time at all, it was first customized, and then it was commoditized. Okay, so even though it had a higher value, all of a sudden now everyone's doing it, doesn't have higher value anymore. So when I traveled down in the Sonoma Valley in California with the senior vice president of one of the grocery store chains, he showed me in the field that they had these rows where all the different types of lettuce for every mix you can think of are growing together. And there's they create a special machine, stainless steel machine about this size, and it just goes right through the bottom and slices off the whole thing right into bags. And just like that, this amazing service is now become a commodity. So there's a process that's always going on here. As you develop something new, as soon as someone else can figure out how to do it, and do it cheaply, it gets to what's called perfect competition. And so now it's competing purely on price. So things are commoditized down this economic progression. Thank you. So anyone know what comes next? When you take services and you customize them to the people who are using those services, now they become experiences. So think of a restaurant. You have a restaurant that has really great food, right? Your restaurant has all these things in it, right? It's got commodities, so there's a basic food. It's got goods, it's got wine and other materials that have been manufactured and produced. It's got services, a maitre d', someone who's providing service, who's advising you on the food. Now, to make this thing an experience, one where you will come back because of the experience, you have to put it all together like you were putting on an opera. All right, you're staging this thing, and it's going to come across like such an event, something you can count on, that you are going to take your spouse back for an anniversary dinner. You're going to invite your friends for a birthday event. It's an experience you're going to count on, and you'll make it part of what you want to do. I wonder if we ought to try it. Sorry about this. So services are customized to become experiences. And you stage experiences like you would theater. And then there's one more step. But actually, maybe I'll give you some illustrations before I jump to that. Think of coffee now to look at these stages. Coffee in a burlap bag that arrives green, the bean that arrives at the port in New York or Los Angeles, is a commodity. As soon as you roast it and do a certain style, you come up with decaf Ethiopian ground coffee or coffee bean. You have a good. If you go to a deli or to a restaurant and you get I go to Curran sometimes, and you get a breakfast for $1.98, and you buy a cup of coffee, you're going to pay maybe $2 for a cup of coffee, and you're getting a service. But when you go to Starbucks, you pay twice that, right? And why do you pay that? You pay it because they've created a certain atmosphere. There's smells, there's space given for you to go and work on your laptop, or to invite a friend and have a conversation there. They've made it into an experience that means you get a premium. So every time you go up, of course, you use the previous level of economy and you add a premium to it. Another example is birthdays. My grandmother was born in 1895, I think. So when she would have done a birthday for her children, what would she have done? She'd have gone out and she'd have bought eggs and flour and milk, and she'd have made a birthday cake. Now my mother grew up. We were kids in the 60s, not 50s, but I think starting in the 50s, people wouldn't have gone out to get the raw materials. They'd have gone out and got a pack of cake mix, right? And they'd make the cake. Well, my generation comes along and we didn't do that any longer. We just called up the bakery shop and said, decorate the cake this way, and I'll come pick it up. And now, my 3-year-old son went to a birthday party just a little ago, even at 3 years old, at the Pump It Up shop. It's like a Chuck E. Cheese. So you outsource the whole birthday, right? So someone is there, they collect the birthday presents, they have a little stage, they figure out when you serve the pizza and when you serve the cake. They roll it all away, and so everything is orchestrated by you. Now what do you think would be the next level? The next level, no one's figured this out yet. The next level is when you customize an experience. Rather than being an experience you remember for one evening, it becomes something that changes you for your lifetime. So this is where you come to transformations. Transform. So you get the transformation economy. I want to talk about this because a great deal of what we do is in the transformation economy, even though we don't charge for it. So there's a principle here that operates, that very often people might operate at this level but charge for that level, or they might provide transformations but not charge as if it were an experience. So let's think about the birthday example. If there were a company that said, look, we are going to really think about the developmental needs of your child, and when you come to that 3-year-old birthday party, we're going to have certain experiences, we're going to recommend certain books, we're going to introduce them to art, we're going to, and then we're going to really kind of inform you what the next year ought to look like, and we're going to facilitate the birthday party next year, and there's going to be a different set of books, and then we've got the whole thing mapped out until your child goes off to college. That would be an organization that was looking at an economic relationship with a family that's facilitating an ongoing transformation. Make sense? All right, I want to just see if you can think of any organizations locally that do transformations. Can you think of any? I'm thinking actually of one that is in the nonprofit sector, and not only does transformation, because as I mentioned, I think all of you do, but actually charges based on that transformation. You know Twin Cities Rise? Twin Cities Rise helps provide job training, right? Supports people who have had a tough time finding jobs, and helps them get jobs. But I believe the way they've structured is they don't get the money for what they've done because they did a training, right? If you charge for your training, you would be providing a service. If you charge because the customers really liked it and got jazzed and were motivated and went out the next day and made 7 calls, you'd be charging for the experience. But if you're billing the government, the state, for the fact that the person has had a job now for a year, I don't know if it's 6 months or a year when they charge, they are actually charging for the outcome. They're charging for a transformation. Go ahead.
Higher education.
Pardon?
Higher education.
Higher education often is providing services, experiences, and even transformations, and generally not charging for it. So think of if you go to you go to MTCT is I'm saying MCCC. You probably have good services and you may have a very good experience. If you go to Harvard Business School or you go to Stanford undergrad, you are not only having good classes and good experience with peers, but you're being re-socialized, introduced to a new network, introduced to entirely different possibilities for your life. When you go to Humphrey and you study at Humphrey, it's not just the services that you're getting, it's the networks and the new ideas about what your life could be that's happening. All right. So I mentioned this idea that things can, in this field, things can be customized and then they can be commoditized. They can move up or down depending on whether everyone else is getting on board. So I want to try applying this to beneficiaries, and I'll use NGOs as an example here. Many NGOs provide value on all 5 of these levels. And so I'm going to rattle off some and think of it. Just think about organizations you work with. Do you provide products at each of these levels, or which ones? So for example, in an emergency situation, American Refugee Committee will come in and right away what will we provide? We'll provide water, we'll provide food, we'll provide tarps for basic shelter, we'll provide blankets for warmth. These are all commodities that are urgently needed and they're really important. In fact, they're life-saving at that early stage. We also provide goods, so medicines. We provide tools for rebuilding agriculture. We might provide books or latrines. We provide water systems. Many, many things we can list at this level. We provide services. So we provide all kinds of technical expertise. We do training for medical specialties, or we teach people techniques for avoiding gender-based violence. We teach techniques around agriculture and microfinance loans. We form groups and teach people how to keep a book and to save money and lend it to each other. How about experiences? Maybe 20 years ago, people didn't think you could really do very much about the fact that children in refugee camps were just completely traumatized and wandering around. Until someone figured out, well, wait a minute, you can create a child-friendly space. You could create a space that normalizes their experience, and you have a teacher, and they feel like they're part of something, and it takes away the complete sense of dislocation that causes such psychic pain. Well, that's actually now providing an experience. Safe houses for victims of abuse and rape. You have you might train people on how to be involved in experiences. Training people on how to do working with people with disabilities and training them how to do spontaneous theater or to use creative gifts to express themselves and develop a community with one another. And even transformations. When you're seeking a transformation, what you're trying to do is you're trying to touch something fairly deep in a person's life, their sense of self. or their sense of possibility, or their awareness not only of a path to change, but actually bring along the motivation to try that path, to experiment and try things out. So any kind of empowerment program with individual and community would be in the transformation area. If you can increase the resilience of a community, you can tell some good stories about this. If you increase the resilience of a community, you are transforming that community because you're creating a sense of possibilities and ideas and tactics and hope where they can work together. When you change the social capital in a community, you build a level of trust in that community to reach out and use the skills, to be vulnerable enough to say, look, I'm really frightened my children aren't getting the nutrition. And you talk to your friend and say, well, why are your children doing better? There's all strategies around positive deviance that are related to this. Those are all transformation economies. So similar to the example of the Twin Cities Rise, one of the projects that ARC was involved with in Liberia was funded by Nike Corporation. And we were working with women, many of whom had been abused. They'd come out of traumatic situations or out of the sex trade. And the idea was that we were going to provide them with training and networking and support to get jobs. But the contract was written so that ARC was not paid until they had been in that job for 6 months. So once again, you're seeking to structure it as a transformation. The power of that, if you can figure out a way to structure this so it's a transformation, is that you're actually aligning the incentives of the individual that you're working with and the organization, right? If we don't get paid as an organization until that person has actually been working steadily, it's got good relationships for 6 months, the risk of our really kind of using it, we can create some success stories, and we did all these trainings, and actually all of them got fired in 2 weeks. That wasn't the case, but do you see what I mean? That if you can figure out a way to align those incentives so that you're actually being reimbursed for the work that you aspire to do, then there's a better fit. Now I asked if you would think of examples, and I wonder, are there some of you who thought of some examples related to commodities that you provide? Anybody? Providing commodities, okay. How about, yes?
Well, I used to work with workers, so it's similar to what we're doing. So that's
Absolutely. How about manufactured goods? I'll just let there be silence until somebody speaks.
We provided like sewing machines and bathtubs?
Yes. Yep. When you provide technical goods like sewing machines and laptops, absolutely. Anything else come to mind?
At least we actually do deal with food commodities, but we move beyond that. We actually created cereal bars.
And what was the reason? So you customized the food, and why did you customize it? Why did you go from here to here?
Other than it was part of our food transformation. Yeah, I guess it's true. I mean, it was really the intention was to try to get local, to improve the opportunity for local food providers to have surge ability to meet like humanitarian crises locally. So in other words, monsoon comes through,
Yep.
local commodities that are going to feed the local population.
And I presume that those were probably easier to store and easier to ship,
Yeah,
right?
cheaper to ship it when it's across town.
Okay, so you made it into a good, so it increases the accessibility of that. They get the advantage of the nutrition, but it's much easier to transport it where it's needed. Okay. How about services? What services do your organizations provide? Research, yes. For example, what sort of research?
I mean, in early childhood, but I mean, working with the communities to offer a service that they don't necessarily have the time or the resources to provide. And so it's kind of an exchange, right?
So anytime you're doing resource linking, like you're advising people on, go to this foundation or go to this website for information or how-tos, you thrive provides this kind of material, isn't it? This is, educational materials. Any other things that come to mind as services that you provide?
I don't work with them, but there's a lot of organizations that figure out medical services, community organizations.
Absolutely.
Those types of organizations.
Psychotherapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy.
I think, let me see, test this. When you, yes, you're right, we're working on services, so that would be, it would be providing a service, not physical therapy. How about experiences? Do any of your organizations provide experiences?
How about a cash for work after a disaster? Is that an experience?
Let's see, cash for work. You're providing them, yes, you're providing them with an employment opportunity, so it's kind of a service, but it becomes an experience because they may not have been employed for a long time, and they become part of the community. In fact, when I was in Mogadishu last January, crazy time to be in Mogadishu, we had done a cash for work program, and we hired 6,000 people to go through the streets and remove rubble in the streets. But we had to very carefully train them how to spot bombs, because bombs were spotted. So we actually had the police and others go, kind of go through the rubble, but they had to be able to identify what looked like a bomb placed in the rubble. But when they fanned out across Mogadishu and did this work, there was a huge response from the population of Mogadishu, because it was this very visible sign of hope. Someone is investing in cleaning up the clutter and getting rid of these incendiary devices that are on the streets. It was quite a powerful signal to the whole community. The mayor got really excited about it. But I think there was another comment.
I was going to say exchange trips, learning exchange trips to and from.
Absolutely. And those can be very powerful experiences. In fact, sometimes they're transformative, right? Unfortunately, they're not always. Sometimes they're kind of NGO tourism, right? You get disaster tourism. It's kind of a way of mocking. This can be misused, but they are powerful experiences, and they start to cause somebody to reflect on your life. Right? Yes.
I was just thinking of the project that the Center for Torture has been doing for a long time in training peer professionals, say for example in Sierra Leone, how to treat trauma.
Yep.
So that would lead to transformation, but I think in and of itself it was a certain experience for that person and for that community to learn.
So they're providing their skills as a service. They may well provide it in a workshop in such a way that it gets a community dynamic going that is quite powerful and hopeful. And we hope.
But they were actually turning them into, they hired the paraprofessionals from the community to be the
Yes.
paraprofessionals doing the
And
service.
they're going out and facilitating a transformation. Good. Any other examples?
Well, the conferences that Youth-wide, like Peace Jam, is an experience, and hopefully it's transformative, but our challenge with that sort of thing is that
Absolutely. A good point. Every time you go up this ladder of economic progression, it not only gets harder to deliver the value, it also gets harder to measure it. So it becomes intangible. So here, I'll show you the rest of the chart now. So you deliver services, you stage experiences, and you guide transformation. So when you move from commodities and goods to services, in all those things, you're providing something to a customer, right? There's something given to the customer. What happens when you get to experiences? What is the thing? It's inside the customer. So the customer is the product. Now, does that make it immeasurably more difficult? Absolutely. It's much more difficult. Think of a therapist. The therapist can't guarantee that the person coming in who's got obsessive compulsive disorder can kind of get some skills and change their view and be hopeful and get out of despair. And we're now trying to facilitate something inside the lives of another person, which is very challenging to do. And of course, now when you move up to the last one, where we're guiding transformation, now it's really challenging because it's not sufficient just to have a really fabulous, week-long conference or a great event. Now you ask the question of how do you sustain this? What are the mechanisms that help people get out of their habits? By the way, have any of you found it easy to break bad habits? Are there some people around here who have the knack? I'd really like to talk to you because I want to learn this. Habits are tough to change. And so when we're trying to facilitate transformations, we have to think of what are the support systems that people need, not just the encouragement. I used to work with alcoholics and addicts and their families. And you know, I was coming right out of grad school. I thought that, you know, the key thing is to give them insight. They need insight into why their behavior is harming them and their family. No. I mean, yes, of course, that's part of the puzzle. But it's much more than that. It's relational, it's love, it's a community that's with them and checking on the phone and walking down the street past the bar so they don't go in. It's incredibly complex, right? Well, isn't this what we're trying to do all the day? We're not only trying to do it for an individual, like helping someone recover from alcoholism. We're trying to do it in the toughest sorts of environments you can think of. So, all right, so this is a review again. You've got these 5 levels of economy, and now you've got a transformation economy. So the simplest version of this, which we've mainly been talking about, is an individual transformation. How do you help a person change their life? How to hope. You know, you take them to Lema Gavoy was talking about having fellowships for girls who would never have access to good school. And that transforms their lives. Then there's community transformation. The difficulty here, you know, okay, we're going magnitude, right? This is just the levels of difficulty. It goes up so much more difficult. And then finally, what are we really trying to do? We're trying to do community transformations in places that have virtually none of the infrastructure and supports that our society has here. Okay, there's not a legal system you can rely on. There's probably not reliable transportation to get things to market. There's not, the appeal system in court doesn't exist, so if you get thrown into jail because someone accuses you of something you didn't do, goodbye. All of the things we count on, and think of how difficult it is. You've worked in nonprofits and organizations in the United States. Well, we rely on the legal system and the educational system to train people that we can hire. And what if you go into Cambodia? You go in you know, the late 80s, early 90s. Everyone's been through famines when they were in utero. Everyone's traumatized. The gentleman I worked with in Cambodia had been kidnapped as a child soldier at age 10 by the Khmer Rouge. For 6 years he was there. He escaped. He was kidnapped by the Vietnamese. He got to a refugee camp, and they kept kidnapping him back again because he'd been trained as a medic by the missionaries, and he was taken back out to the field to do medicine for the guys on until he was 20. He finally managed to get away from it. Now this gentleman, bless his heart, he was the director of human resources for a $10 million NGO in Phnom Penh. And he did a damn good job. I don't know how he held his life together. So my part of my role there was to mentor him and to figure out how does he expand his ability, really, because he had the capacity to become the country director of a very sizable, significant, complex program. It's amazing what resilience you encounter. People have gone through things that are magnitudes more difficult than what we've been through. But that's the kind of challenge we're seeking to bring about. When we do leadership development in other contexts, we're trying to compensate for all kinds of infrastructure and supports and learning that simply wasn't there in many places. Right? So, it's a challenge, kind of tough. Was there a comment back there? Okay, thanks. Okay, so I think I just want to ask, I want to give an illustration about this notion of how things can be customized and commoditized in the field of international development. So if you think about the field of gender-based violence, I don't know the timing. The American Refugee Committee and World Vision and some other organizations were involved in this pretty early on, but it probably was about 15 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, that people really were struggling with the issue of how much women and girls particularly are violated and abused in refugee situations of displacement. It's just It's really rampant. And we're struggling with what can we do about this? And there really weren't many models to figure out how to do it. And there's a pretty strong sense of dismissal in the funding community of things that seem psychological. Like, oh, we can't possibly do therapy with all these people. We just don't have the funds. So several organizations started experimenting with things. What can we do that could help people kind of become aware of this? That isn't just re-traumatizing them, because there are all kinds of mistakes you can make in that field. And one of the things they came up with was the participatory video development, right? If you teach a group of people in a community or of women who've been traumatized about how to use videos and create their own stories, now what you're doing is what in economic circles is called mass customization. In other words, you're customizing the product that's being taken to those communities by making the individuals in those communities themselves the designers of that product. That's mass customization. We see it now in business in lots of ways, where you can interact with a website, you design your own product, you tell Nike exactly what it's going to look like, and you customize your own product, right? So if you use participatory video, you train people in techniques for directing and teach them how to tell a story, and you help them identify what story they want to tell, and then they create the video, and then they go out and they do showings in their community. And now they're actors. Now they're the ones who are leading the conversation. It starts making it possible to really do something powerful, because we as outsiders are out of the picture. We just provided some resources, some ideas, and now it's got momentum of its own, right? Now, that's a customization. It's a customization. We took goods, we took technical equipment for video, right? We taught them how to tell a story and do video. They took it out to have experiences, and believe me, the folks who did those experiences and took them out, they were transformed. And some communities were as well. There was fairly good data on measurement that showed that people who've been exposed to these stories twice, by a vastly different proportion, believed hitting your wife was wrong. The measurement had to be pretty but that's a kind of transformation. Now, here's the problem in the field. A group of NGOs, a group of individuals thought very hard about how to tackle this problem, and they came up with a strategy, right? ARC is not a terribly big NGO as they go, about $50 million NGO. Compare that to CARE, a couple billion. World Vision, 2.7 billion. Well, what does USAID want when something goes well? They want a success story, right? They want to publish it. So what happens the next time something goes on in the community? Well, ARC or Land O'Lakes, sends, you get a gender-based violence person, and there weren't many, but we had them because we developed it. So we send that person to Kenya to do it. What does DAI do? They send 10 technical specialists, and they've got a team of some of the best writers you can find in DC that are writing that whole proposal, and all of a sudden the field is flooded with every single organization saying they know exactly how to do it, and they have these resources, and guess who gets that contract? The organization that's 100 times bigger. So things are commoditized very quickly, all right? It's just a reality in this field. You work really hard at innovation, it can be taken, because it works, by a larger player quite quickly. Is this a bit frustrating? It is frustrating. Of course, there are disadvantages to being part of those big players too. Okay, and maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, so I just want to, before I move on, I'm going to go on to look at the other side of this. I've been focusing on the beneficiary. I want to look at the donor side. But before I do that, I just want to see, are there any clarification questions about the concept? Yes?
When you talk about commodification and how contracts get taken away from certain organizations and given to others, and that's a bad thing, are we losing sight of the fact that now 10 times more people are healing from these things?
You point out a good thing. No, it's the diffusion of the technique is wonderful. So it's a good thing that the technique is brought up. But it does create a problem inside organizations. When you do the work of customizing, in business terms you call it barriers to entry. If you launch a new program and there are no barriers to entry, then someone else mimics it right away, and you lose the capacity to sustain it. But no, the fact that good ideas get picked up.
No, I'm not talking about good ideas though. I mean, you talk about one side being the organization and the other side being the donor. But at the end of the day, aren't all NGOs in business to work ourselves out of business, as opposed to setting up this dependent
Sure.
income stream for disseminating ideas.
Maybe we'll take this to the question about the donor, and you and I can talk about it more. Yes, we are, but the reality is most of us are working in places where it's nowhere near time for us to go out of business. We keep finding some needs that are really important. But yes, in organizations, there's always an incentive towards self-preservation that sometimes is counterproductive. Any other questions or clarification?
Just if you're talking more about the transformation, I mean, I know this is a huge question, but how would we kind of essentialize transformation in terms, especially in terms of the relationship to sustainability? So what I mean by that is, I mean, you can easily say for that instant or that moment, that individual may have changed, but then you were talking about how do you keep that going, right? So, I mean, a lot of this is related to that moment or in that point in time, but it's not necessarily taking into context over 10 years. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if it's not sustained, then it is effectively an experience, not a transformation. And there are so many issues where this becomes a challenge. Some of you may be involved with collective impact projects in the U.S. It's really a new name for an old phenomenon. Essentially, organizations working together across sectors, business, government, nonprofit, to solve what they call wicked problems. And they're wicked. But those are problems that change as you touch them. Every time you try to do something, the balloon kind of bursts out in a different way. And so there are a lot of problems where, as smart and well-meaning as we may all be, we haven't figured out how to solve these problems without having a social, very large scale and to sustain them. So it's a challenging bit of work. Yeah.
I guess I was going to say, I think in some organizations I've seen when there has been transformation that's occurred, a lot of times those individuals or those communities then sort of place themselves farther down, say at a services level. They start to be part of the process.
Yeah.
And I think that is an indication of success.
Yeah.
In a way, that they now come up with a different idea or a different way of doing something.
Right.
And they sort of re-enter, whereas they weren't one of the players before.
Yeah, at any one of these levels, you can be sustained at any one of these levels. So you can provide water systems and be a very effective organization. So I don't mean to suggest that you need to move up this, but many of us are aspiring to be transformation organizations, and we haven't necessarily thought about how does the organization pull that trick off. I'm going to shift now and look at the other side of it. So what I've described here is a model that's true in for-profit settings, right? And because if you can facilitate this, the customer comes to you, they want the transformation or the experience, and they pay you for it, right? That's not our world, right? We're working with customers who can't pay for it. And we have to have another transaction, another interaction with a donor to get paid for it. So what happens is, now we have two pyramids, right? You get a transformation economy you're trying to bring about, or even a commodity economy, with the donor. So I'm using pyramids today. Use different colors here. So the organization is in between these two realities of the donor, on the donor side, and of the beneficiary. Now, does it seem odd to use this? It may seem odd, I suppose, to use this in relation to people who are giving you money. So let me talk about it a little bit. What kind of commodities might you get from a donor when you give a contribution? Have any of you ever gotten a commodity when you give a contribution? A t-shirt or a mug, right? You've gotten those sorts of things. Maybe you get refrigerator magnets. You get mailing labels. Right? You're getting things. I can't see that.
Oh, you can see it.
Pardon?
I didn't know you could see it.
I don't have my glasses on. So, but in fact, somewhere I'm misplacing my phone, which has my time. Thank you. Yes, I thought maybe you were. Since I don't know where I put my phone, I can't actually monitor myself. Sorry. Somewhere under all this is, okay, so you might get a bumper sticker, you might get a coffee mug with a logo. Is that yours? Did you take it?
No, Colleen took it when she looked up.
Oh, all right. Crazy. All right, so you've got some commodities. Then let's think about the next level. What are some goods that you might get from a donor that would facilitate a donation? You think something? A book, absolutely. A personal letter. You might, if you sponsor your child, you might get or you might get a personal letter from a CEO who would send you something. You might get a photograph or a video from a sponsored child. And more and more it's going on the internet, so you can stay connected. You might get a video on a website that's telling about the immediate response in Haiti after the earthquake. And you can get someone walking through a refugee camp and see that.
Advertising, like sponsorships?
Yep.
Does that fall under goods or services?
I think it would fall under goods, the advertising piece, because you're getting stories that tell you about what's happening there. How about services?
Tax deduction.
Tax deduction. Boy, I hadn't thought of that. How would that fit?
That's a good.
It's certainly an incentive. Is it a good? Yeah, I suppose. You go to a presentation about conflict minerals in the Congo. All right, and you get someone's kind of giving you information and helping you think about this. You work with a local NGO and you give them tips on how to raise funds, how to do grants. You have an education program, or you go to a talk about. Excuse me, I'm probably mixing things up. But, a talk about the political changes in Myanmar. I'm learning about the world and what's going on. I have a service. An experience might be you're invited to a small reception to meet the Nobel laureate who's coming to town. And you get to have your picture taken and talk to her. You get to sleep under the stars with a group of teenagers. So you could pay money that would go to buying tarps for people who live out under have no shelter. You are part of a 40-hour famine to raise money for hunger relief. These are experiences that help you identify with what someone is giving out there, and you would raise money to do it. You go on a short-term mission trip to build houses in Tijuana, and it's an experience that would help you to give. Some of you may know about the big event, the AIDS experience, that traveled around to different countries that taught you what it was like if you were going to an AIDS clinic. Or let's say you do a 5K run to raise money for Somalia. Okay. How about some transformations? Now, the holy grail of donor relations is transformations, is it not? You want your donor to be so convicted about the power of what you do that they will volunteer or serve on your board or tell everybody they know, and they'll leave money in their will, right? You're ultimately looking for someone. Yes?
Where would you place your donors' improved sense of self-value because they feel they have participated in a worthwhile venture?
The question is whether it's sustained or not. I would place that as an experience or potentially a transformation.
Okay.
You think? If it alters the donor's sense of who they are, they see themselves differently, that's certainly an experience. If it's sustained, it's a transformation. Any of you, can you think of any other transformations that you've been involved with? Or maybe not involved with, but aspire to be involved in?
We train non-runners to run marathons.
Yes. Yeah, so they're learning new skills, they're learning about their capacities. That's great.
We take them to Africa then to run a marathon in Africa.
Wow.
Transformation.
Yeah. And then if particularly I would assume if they're younger runners, you may be looking for a lifelong.
Maybe 50s, 60s.
Oh, okay. Great. Other examples?
Well, just that highlights that most of the transformation economy is really experiences that have been tweaked so that it has ongoing effects. I mean, it could be, it's almost always an experience that then is partnered with an ongoing giving group or ongoing experiences that over time build into habits and build into culture that we want our donors to have.
Right. And your point about it being tweaked so it moves from experience to transformation is the nature of customization. If it's more closely connected to that person's aspirations or their life or their, the way they handle their life, if those experiences work together so they develop habits, then you produce the transformation.
I'm thinking of St. Jude as the preeminent NGO that deals in transformation. I've not been there myself, but I worked for an organization with a deep relationship with every person who went to St. Jude and met children who were patients there. So it was transformational.
Wow, that's fabulous.
Transformational synonymous with sustainable change. You're trying to influence whether it's medical care or education. Isn't the goal to implement this program and have it be sustainable, so transformation and sustainability kind of the way that school areas and synonymous?
Yes, I think that's right.
Can you repeat that?
The comment was that transformation is really the same as what in many areas we call sustainable change. Yeah. So when you're doing community development and you're looking at how do we produce greater resilience or change the economic value, production, the ability to produce in that community on a permanent basis, that's transformation. One example of this, some friends of mine started an NGO in Myanmar called Proximity Design. And they just won the award last year from the Skoll Foundation for the Social Enterprise of the Year. And what they did is they figured out that the spouse, Debbie, the wife is Burmese, and the husband, Jim, is from Seattle. And they did a lot of market research, and they figured out that they could manufacture treadle pumps, foot pumps, for people who are subsistence farmers. The water table is high around almost all of Burma. And they could sell these manufactured in-country for $25. Kind of a snap-together kit. People who earned less than $1 a day, $200 a year families, would pay an extra $5 to get a kit that was easily assemblable. It was astounding to them. They bought these kits, they did market research. It's not just that they got a return on what they paid, the $25. It's not that they made $50. They doubled their annual income. On average, the families went from $200 or $300 a year to twice that, because they now could irrigate twice the amount of vegetables, high-value vegetables, off-season, in all the communities where they worked. That's a completely different sort of model when you say, what's the return on donors' money, not just for, we double that money, because they made some money, but we actually impact their lives in that way. You're producing sustained transformation. So they had documentation over years. What did you do the first year with that extra money? Well, we ate a second meal every day. What did you do the second year? Well, we were able to send all the kids to school. What did you do the third year? We bought gold bracelets. This is the poorest families in Burma because that's the way they save. That's the way they show and save money. It's buying gold jewelry. So there's some very powerful stories. Any other examples that come to mind? Yeah.
Donors who reproduce themselves in terms of finding other donors who might spread it.
Yeah. So they become missionaries on behalf of the NGO and they tell the story. Yeah. So that then you get a replicability of that. I had a really life-changing experience when I was 22 and went to work in the southern part of the Congo and worked with it's actually not a donor. I'm giving you an experience from the other side, but it's a story about sustained change. And I worked with a young Anglican bishop and his wife who were just amazing people and kind of took me in as a partner, even though I was very green and very immature. But we ended up starting up theological education by extension groups with African independent churches. These are independent, indigenous Congolese churches that never had any connection with the outside. And they were leadership groups, really basic leadership, where they were teaching each other. And at the end of the 3 years there, I did a training for the 10 of them to then sustain them back in their own communities. Shortly after I left, things just went terribly in the Congo. And many of them, there were pogroms, many of those church leaders were chased away. The bishop had to flee the country. And for 10 years, there was no investment and there wasn't any infrastructure to support that. When I later met the bishop after that time period, he said they survived for 10 years with that condition. They kept on these facilitated groups, essentially a peer learning network, through the midst of civil unrest. It was, you know, when you get to see something like that happen, somehow something's clicked and people have owned it. And that's really exciting. So your example about a donor, where it's just clicked, it's given them life, and now they become the advertisers for it. It's really exciting.
So the organization that you can buy like half a cow or a chicken or something like that, would that be in that category?
What would that be? If you're like a heifer project, in other words, you're
Right.
putting money into a community so they have a product which is then going to, if it's well cared for, produce more milk and produce more cows, right?
Right.
So yes, that potentially has an ongoing sustained change, an ongoing sustained economic impact in that community. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here. I mentioned that I was talking about these two realities, and we also mentioned that these are in very different worlds, right, in terms of culture. So just want to suggest a little bit about the culture in which, the difference of the cultures we operate in. So I want to tell a little story. In one of the organizations I worked with, there was a difficult problem. In a country where we worked, the burn rate, that is how much the team was spending the money given to them, was very low. So they were halfway through the year and they'd only spent a quarter of the funds. So it's looking like they weren't going to be able to accomplish the project. So we were wrestling with what's going on and why isn't it happening and what has to be done. And is it local? Is it at the national level? Is it the regional level? Is it at the global level? And the conversation got pretty heated. And someone who was from the field said, oh, we just haven't taken into account the culture of what's really going on there. And immediately the CFO snapped, quite angrily, saying, culture is excuse. Now, does that surprise you? Culture is excuse. Is it ever true? Yes, it is true. Sometimes culture is an excuse. Sometimes it's a way to hide lack of accountability or failure to achieve outcomes. So there's truth to it. But there's also an attitude that you don't meet uncommonly that says culture is kind of beneath us. It's too difficult to figure out when we're working in 80 different countries' culture. So if you bring it up, you're just trying to get away from being accountable. What's going on between these worlds when the perspective from over here, kind of, and by the way, this happened to be, discussed in the management. It was occurring within the organization that was in between these two worlds, with folks that were working with a donor and the executive team and the folks that were representing the country program. What was going on in that? No, we have to understand what's going on. We haven't really thought through the culture, but culture is excuse. Have you encountered this before? Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's going on?
For me, it's like that one group is sending this message that we are better than you, that our values are what you need to do. So.
Right, so it's kind of an ethnocentrism, like our value over here is accountability, and you don't value it like we do.
Right.
And so we trump, we get to trump you, by the way. Right, so that's not uncommon. And is trust a problem in NGOs? We usually have really good trust, don't we? There's all kinds of reasons why trust breaks down. Because there's so many factors that can lend to something not being reliable in return, or the communication not being completely understood. And we're often, as executives, bewildered. We know our organizations and we can't figure out why the metrics seem to be going the wrong way.
It's also if you're taking American donors, or I shouldn't say just American, but donors or organizations as kind of neutral culture, because we do have an organizational culture and our funders all have a culture. But if you're just looking at the group that you're serving, they need to conform to this
standard protocol that's not taking into account our own biases.
Well, it's very difficult to be aware of your own culture when let's say you're working with, in the case of World Vision, 20 donor countries. I don't mean the individual donors like USAID, I mean 20 countries that are raising your funds. And you have 80 beneficiary countries that you're working with. So if you're sitting up here and you're the chief operating officer, or you're in charge of programs, and you're trying to figure out what's going on here, well, how can you possibly pay attention to culture? At least that's the way it feels. And so we default, it's true, in these organizations what we need to do is we need to develop a metaculture that has the capacity to interpret between these worlds. But what we default to is a management culture. What we learned when I did an MBA, I learned it very well. And it's because that is the language of international economics. And so naturally our cultures, unless it's a very strong culture default to that.
Just quickly ask, so when you say metaculture, you wouldn't say that as the same as transculture, right?
No, what I mean by that is,
You just say universal?
what I mean is an organization of culture needs to find a way to facilitate a conversation so that the constituent parts understand each other. So a metaculture is a kind of culture that isn't automatically defaulting to one of the subcultures, American or Australian or French or Ghanaian. And it takes a lot of work in such a complex world to create that.
In your experience, what organizations do that have a metaculture that allows for?
I would say my experience is broad enough to recommend the ones that do it really well. Because I think the ones that I've consulted with and worked with have a very difficult time, as Americans generally do, even realizing there's such a thing as culture. And so I think there's just an automatic default to it.
I work with a group that's public organizations in Latin America, and I think our metaculture might be evidence studies. So there's something that both Latin Americans and North Americans identify. Not exactly the same.
Sure.
But it's a common.
Isn't part of the role then to translate one to the other, to stand in the gap and represent or interpret or create experiences?
Right, and to figure out when do you do it. So there's certain things like accountability, which was the topic we were coming up with, this accountability question in that particular example. Certain things trigger it because they're sort of in the sweet spot of one culture, and donors are all seeking accountability, right? And well, they should. That's part of taking this money and being faithful to the promise we make to donors. And yet it means something very different in a culture that's based differently. So I'm going to take this example and go ahead. Now, I want to ask you this question. What response do you get when you ask staff to change something they're comfortable doing? Okay, here, I'll show it to you. Here's the response you get. Oh, no, maybe I could do this. Hold on. What was the response? See it? Did anybody see it?
Yes.
It was yes, right?
Yeah.
It was nothing but no's. It was full of no's. What do you mean? It wasn't full of no's. Now, have you ever encountered that? That's not even across cultures. Of course, it's exaggerated across cultures, but even in our own culture, when you're trying to do a change project and you talk to your team and they all say, yes, we're on board, that's the response we get. All right, so what I wanted to do is just to suggest a very simple model about how we think about this divide. And it has to do with how we think about order and relationships. Every society values order and relationships. They're all critical. We'd have chaos if we didn't. But Western society prioritizes it differently than traditional societies. So in Western societies, order comes before relationships when they come into conflict. Okay, when push comes to shove. And in traditional and indigenous societies, relationship trumps order when they come into conflict. So think about Think about American movies, the Western. What happens in the Western? All right, you're in the Wild West, things are chaotic, people are being mistreated, there's all kinds of bad relationships and bad order, and the lawman comes into town, and what does he ultimately do? Does he hold up, does he take the bad guy to the court? Nope, he doesn't. Because when push comes to shove, you can kill the guy to reestablish order. If you want to go into a Muslim country that was part of the whole movement of the Crusades and has a long history, and you know that there's chaos there, and you figure you can impose order at the point of a gun, and then assume that democracy is going to develop on its own, does it work? No, that's the approach that order trumps relationship. It doesn't matter that Marines are going through the family of the Muslim family when women are present practicing purdah. It doesn't matter because we're just reestablishing order, and then relationships will reemerge. But what's the violation that's happened? The sense of the wrong that's occurred to the dignity and values of that culture. There's a wonderful book, if you ever see it, it's called Backfire. It's a book about why the Vietnam War happened the way it did and why we lost. And the basic premise of the book is we fought the Vietnam War because we had no understanding of culture. Not only didn't understand Vietnamese culture, but didn't know that there was such a thing as culture. And so we completely misinterpreted what was happening in that context. Fought a war with huge loss, and essentially just poured fuel on the fire of the rebellion and the fight against us until eventually we had to leave. This has to do with how you prioritize order and relationship. Go ahead.
I got partway through this book, The Outpost by Jay Tabor, on the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, and they were certainly trying to meet up with the folks. I mean, yeah, they had to have the guns also, but they, did the relief and the schools and all that stuff, and they still, so they were doing their best to reach the culture.
Yeah. No, I do think the U.S. military has come a long way from the days of Vietnam. I don't know the book, but these are very, very difficult puzzles to solve. And I think the main takeaway I just wanted to make is these differences are pretty profound. and they take, we see them in nuances and little interactions and in big ones too. But they shape a lot of what happens in
Sorry,
work.
it was just that even though they tried, it still was really, really hard.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's true for us as well. If you think about the principle of trust, you say, well, we really ought to trust each other. Trust in this society where accountability and delivery on the funds and where you're an executive and you see circumstances where there was sexual abuse by staff abusing people under their care, and you see situations of fraud. You see situations where the trust is deeply violated. What tends to happen when you're an executive on this side? You tend to get pretty jaded, don't you? Because you, frankly, in our organizations, that information is often held privately because it's extremely sensitive. But it goes on. You get your staff kidnapped. You have 2 staff killed by a suicide bomb in Somalia. You're dealing with huge stresses, and you can become paranoid and distrusting and fearful, and it influences how you make decisions. As you go up in organizations, the very strong tendency, for profit and non-profit, is to become more distrustful of people that are on the front line. And so it's just one of our challenges of how we work in this world that we need to counteract that. Because if we do that, we become unable to work effectively in our own organizations. I want to just illustrate 2 things, and if we had a smaller group, what I would do is I'd ask you to line up along a spectrum here where you are on these things. But I did this with one group. It was really quite interesting. If one end of this room was the end that represented the world is like a machine, and the way you work in the world is you think about the processes and systems and you get things lined up so it functions, right? That's the way we work in the world. And the other end is the world is like an organism. It's like a living thing with relationality and intent and purpose and motive. There's no motive or personality on that end. How many of you would line up over down there when you think about the work of NGOs? Is this work like, to do this well, is it really like functioning in world as machine? Would any of you put yourself down there? It's okay. No one's going to volunteer. All right. Okay, so how about this then? How many of you would say you world as organism? Okay, most of you not in your heads. Okay, so let me just test this for a minute, because I don't believe you. So let's say now there's a movement, thank goodness, that's challenging standard ways that we think about business management and saying, no, actually that's control-oriented and it's inadequate and we need to be much more relational, and thank goodness there's this movement. So it's saying we need to be over here. But let's say you come from the United States and you're a project manager of a program in Mogadishu. You go to Mogadishu, Somalia, and it is utter chaos. Nothing works. The country manager on a daily basis is approached by the member of parliament or by the local warlord saying, here's my nephew I want you to hire. If he says no, not only is the program likely to be kicked out, but someone might lose their life. What tribe he is, what clan he's connected to, who he talks to, how he mobilizes energy means everything. Now, if you're in that environment, would you think that maybe what they need is a little more machine-like? Sure you would. All of us would, wouldn't we? We think, no, you need some procedures, you need some objectivity, you need an HR committee that does your recruiting so you don't have to be personally involved. We think very much like the world is like machines. We're trying to soften that, our awareness that that's been too strong. But the truth is, when you go into a society that is very relational, I'll bet most of us are the machine people. Right? Is that unfair?
No.
Because we adapt to the circumstances we're in. And if you put yourself in a very mechanistic organization in the US, you probably are relational people, right? Okay, comment back there.
I was in Kenya last year and was engaging in conversation with many of the locals, and they were talking about how distrustful the police were. And then I started talking to them about judges and the court system, and then they started talking about how distrustful the courts and the judges were. And then I started talking to them about the Supreme Court, and they were saying that, well, the Supreme Court can't be trusted in any way. So immediately I started thinking, well, to solve this problem, all you need to do is create trustworthy Supreme Court, which would then create trustworthy courts, which then provides a stable, foundation to trust the police officers, which then provides stability for law within the country. That's all you need to do.
That's all you need to do.
That's all you need to do.
You're smart.
So I went to order on that.
Well, and many of us do. And so when you're bridging these cultures, the question is, how do you make decisions when tough decisions are required? Now I want to move on, so I just want to offer one other element of this. I mentioned order tends to be associated with a mechanistic view of the world. Some of you may know Stephen Pepper's work about root metaphors, and this is one of the really profound root metaphors. And the other is world as organism. The only other thing I want to mention here is it's interesting. There's a particular type of language that is preferred here to here. This is a noun-based culture, and this, in many cases, is a verb-based culture. Noun-based because we like to categorize things. We want to know what class it belongs in. Is it an apple or is it an orange? Bounded sets is what anthropologists talk about this. We focus on the boundary in order to tell what category something fits in. So race, and that's a construct based on bounded set thinking. Whereas other cultures are much more action-oriented. It's in the doing, it's in the being, it's something dynamic, movement over time. One way to talk about this is the difference between anthropologists talk about synchronic and diachronic reality. The one reality is that you create a blueprint of a car. That's truth, right? Because you know exactly the way you have the slice, you get blueprints, you know exactly how to build that car. The other reality is to tell a story over time, a narrative that changes, that has human beings, that evolves, it's dynamic. One's static, but has truth, the other's dynamic. we are often crossing this profound divide when we are doing this sort of work. So now I'm going to shift gears because I've given you lots of examples and we've chatted a bit. So what I want to do now is ask the question again about how does the organization operate between those profoundly different worlds. So if you think of an organization as relating to three constituencies, the one is it's got a part of the organization that tries to deliver this value to beneficiaries. And you've got part of the organization that tries to deliver this value to the donor so that the donor stays connected. And then a part of the organization, executive team mostly, is relating to the board and charity, certain external validation groups that tell you you're doing a good job. Now, if you're in a very simple organization, you might have, let's say you have a headquarters in Minneapolis and you have one office in Uganda, okay? Here's your Uganda office, and then you've got your headquarters, and in your headquarters you've got a donor, I did this backwards, sorry. I meant to put Uganda over here, and then the beneficiary. So you've got one office that's relating there, and then the headquarters has all of your people who are working with donors, right? Now, a bigger organization, let's take American Refugee Committee, might have 10 country offices here, and then the headquarters staff, and then they have a DC-based staff. So the donor relations happens from both headquarters and from the DC-based staff. When you get to be a care or save, this gets vastly more complex. I once constructed a 3D model of it. You get 80 country organizations all around the world, 4 regional offices of great size. So one of the regional offices for World Vision, the Africa office, had 179 staff. One of 4 regional offices. You've got an international team, and then you've got 20 country offices that raise funds. And then, of course, you've got a local, a World Vision rep in Minnesota even. So, like folks who are working very, very closely with a donor and customizing the product so it fits that culture and that age group, right? This is an enormously complex organization to try to manage, isn't it? Yeah, 20 of those country offices. So here's the question I want to ask about accountability. Accountability to whom? Is there one accountability? No, there's a question of how are we accountable to the promises we make to the donors? As we accept money and we make commitments? How are we accountable to the beneficiaries, where we make at least tacit promises that we are not going to do harm, we are there for their good? How are we accountable to the external board, or the media, or the government that monitors nonprofit organizations? Have any of you ever been in an organization that's balanced these? This is tough work. It's really tough work. Go ahead. That's true.
So I just think that, because they also have missions where they're individual, and they also go back to their funding basis of their organization. It's not donors necessarily, but they have money from some governments, but it's the public who's giving them that's individual. But I think they agree with it, but it's a bit different because they're not relying on this money in the community outside of the casino or.
Well, you make a good point. It makes a huge difference what your donor base looks like, right? If your donor base is individual giving, you've got an enormous amount of strategic flexibility, sponsorship type funds. I think something in the neighborhood of half of World Vision's funding globally is probably sponsorship. That gives incredible flexibility to redirect things, to open new office, to do things. But if your funds are all based on grants, let's say USAID, OFDA, BPRM grants, a lot of organizations have 96, 92, 97% of their funds from grants. Do you have the ability to build a culture if all your money comes from grants? No, you don't. You are a contract culture. Your culture is determined by each and every separate contract that you run. And those are competitive contracts. So guess what? You've got to make a lot of tough competitive choices to win that contract when you're competing against Atlantic Lakes, for example. No, it's true. No. So yes, you make and if your funding base is faith-based, it makes a big difference in their motivation. Often faith-based organizations have a level of loyalty that's the envy of everybody, because they've got another community that helps them sustain certain commitments, right? Okay, so let me just make a couple of simple remarks here. It really is fascinating to think about the mechanisms that influence those three. I just want to suggest something simple and see what you think. I think when organizations are quite small or simple, or maybe when their mission is pretty simple, like
Well, some of that medical work is where,
Yeah.
again, so we do have
Yeah.
outcomes, we can see outcomes, but I think that's something like education.
Yeah.
Because donors want that measure, they want concrete measurement, and that's something that it takes time to build, and you're not going to see immediate results, but that's what donors want.
So if you're a small organization or a very focused organization, I think it's easier to keep this be the dominant focus. If you think about how those three are balanced, because especially at start, if you've got to really get your product working, you pay a lot of attention to that. A lot of organizations at the mid-level have the dominant accountability here, because they are having to follow the flow of money to sustain any kind of strategic flexibility. But when you get to be one of the mega organizations, let's say the 5 to 10 organizations that are over $1 billion, you are sufficiently insulated from any outside accountability that I think you don't actually answer to any of those three constituencies. You answer to an internal executive branch. It is very, very powerful when you don't actually have to be. You don't actually have to do a heck of a lot of what USAID says. I mean, yeah, you got to keep the relationship going, but you know what? They need big channels. They can't afford to parcel out this money to a bunch of organizations that are $100 million in size. And there's a real risk in this field that the whole field becomes insular. Even the media, even muckrakers who occasionally find stories, don't have incentives to keep going after the good guys. So there's a real challenge here of how, and by the way, some of you may have noticed this, in the big organizations, the board is usually made up of about half for-profit people from the largest corporations. Now, for-profit leaders, executives from CEOs, and let's say Fortune 500 companies usually are not terribly humble, right? So when it comes to deciding who's going to be the next president of this $2 billion organization, what do they say? It's got to be a businessman. And the nonprofit people don't believe that crap, but they're not quite sure because the problems are big. And more organizations are opting to select executives at the top level who have never worked in any development context at all. They do not have even a basic experiential experience of what it's like to do this kind of work. So when you have that situation, what tends to happen is a very sizable gulf occurs between the executive team and the rest of the organization. It is a discourse gap. A profoundly different discourse happens in the organization at the executive level with the board and with the McKinseys that come in to advise them than it does with the rest of the organization. Now, I don't mean to be gloomy because this can be solved and organizations are struggling with this tendency all the time, but I do want to be straight in my own experience and both consulting and working. This is a very strong push, and it's influenced by the way Western culture thinks about the work. It's influenced by the culture of order and of machine. All right. Let me wrap up here. I promised to do one last thing, and I want to talk about an element of change management. Obviously, if you're going to do strategy, my advice to you, my strong encouragement, I hope you buy it, is that it starts with really listening externally. Like really understanding, is the product delivering the value in a sustainable way to your external community? Not an easy thing to do. But once you've decided on a strategy, then you have to deal with how are you going to bring in line this whole complex organization where there's big gaps of trust already, right, internally. Generally speaking, big change initiatives, and I'm talking, 10, 20, 100 million. I was involved with one that was a $200 million set of change initiatives across a global organization. big change initiatives are pulling in the McKinseys and the Booz Allen Hamiltons and Accentures, and most of their work is where? Commodities, goods, and services. It's not transformation. So they may not even kind of know what we're talking about when we're talking about this stuff. Thank you. Okay, I've skipped past this one, but I'll go ahead and give it. So, because this is still relevant. When you're doing one of these change initiatives, you really have to do two things at once, and one of them tends to get all the energy. The energy goes to the first one, preparing the change for the organization. All the design teamwork. You've got to get the design really good, it's got to be technically good. Little work goes into preparing the organization for the change. That is, if you really do have the right idea of what this needs to be, and you need to align the organization, somehow the organization has to have a context for them to understand this, why it works for them. So, oops, wrong way. So what I want to suggest, and maybe this won't be too hard to guess where I'm drawing this illustration from, but I found this to be a very useful tool for understanding stakeholder engagement. That is, rather than doing stakeholder engagement the way it's usually done, individually, I actually tracked a list of 200 senior executives around this organization, and their views on all of 15 different change initiatives. Very complicated thing to do. It was password protected, no one got to see that, not even the president got to see that list, because it would have made people mad to know what their view was written down on things. You can't do a major strategic initiative and track that many people. You need to find a similar way to talk about what's going on in the organization. And so, as a parting thing, I want to suggest this way to think about subcultures. Your organization probably doesn't have all these, may have different ones, but this is fairly representative of faith-based organizations that do a variety of things. One subculture I've already talked about, it's the MBA subculture. Strongest values in that culture are ROI, efficiency, accountability, order, right? And there's a great deal of value and evidence to support those values. The second subculture that I talked about is the marketing and fundraising. It's oriented towards growth. Give me a sales target, give me a growth target. It's oriented towards public perception, creating the media environment for me to successfully raise funds to expand this good work. Third one is the long-term development. Okay, you're in a country for a long period of time, and you really need to look for money that has an extended time frame. The value system there is around empowerment and sustainability, and often this can be a very academic specialty area because it's so complex, and you need universities and research to figure out what are all these methodologies for long-term development. Another group is the relief cowboys, the folks that are going in when there's an emergency. ARC, as I mentioned, did a fair amount of emergency work. The time frame between long-term development and relief guys is completely different, and you can tell it in everything they do. But the answer is, look, people are dying. Let's get this done. Let's get in there. Let's get out of there. There's also an advocacy subculture. Some of you have been involved with Oxfam, for example. An advocacy culture is looking at the same kinds of challenges, but with a completely different lens. It's asking, how do we facilitate structural change at the highest level of policy? And so the value system there is about leveraging collaboration across organizations, right? So the advocacy people will say, why aren't we working with SAVE? Why aren't we working with Oxfam? Are the humanitarian guys in the long-term development going to ask those questions? Usually not. Hey, it's hard enough to manage this just with us. Why bring in another big player with another culture? And then the final one, and this is interesting because in a faith-based organization, this may be the biggest one in terms of numbers of people. It's the folks that join for religious reasons. My faith is important to me. This organization is doing good things out of faith. I'm there as a missionary, not necessarily to proselytize, but I'm trying to do good because my faith calls me to do that. This is true if it's a Muslim institution. It doesn't have to be a Christian institution. Now, the reason I put these up, and I mentioned the values of compassion and witness to one's faith. The reason I put these up is if you launch an initiative, a big, expensive, $10 million initiative for a new way of doing governance, board governance, or a new way of doing strategy, or a new program information system, which subculture is going to determine the way that communication is written?
Executive management.
Which one?
Executive management.
Absolutely. It's going to be written from the perspective of efficiency and ROI. Now tell me, how are these other subcultures going to respond? Look at their values. How are they going to respond to something that says we have to cut costs, we're going to be able to really bring in more money, we're going to get greater efficiency, the whole thing's going to work better? How are they going to respond? It's soulless. It's anathema. It's not talking about why we're here. It's business stuff. Some of you probably had this reaction the way I was talking today, right? Because I was talking on business, right? These subcultures are very, very powerful because they're deep in us. If you want to facilitate change across a complex organization, my recommendation is that you use a simple tool like this one. Basically, understand what are the subcultures that really influence people's sense of identity and purpose. Understand their values, interview them, really explore this so you understand them deeply. And then ask the question in relation to whatever change you're trying to facilitate. What is the need from their perspective? Why would they value this? What does it have to do for them to value this? What is the benefit for them? The benefit of changing from what they used to do. And then finally, and this is the most important one, who are the iconic figures that shape the way that culture goes? If you don't find the top 2, 3, 4 people in that subculture and really sit down and listen to them, they're going to sabotage what you're trying to do. There was an example, a World Vision example, where a very good initiative was proposed to World Vision's Global Council. I think there are something like 350 members of World Vision's Global Council. It's the highest level of authority. So all big decisions have to be approved by this group. There was a proposal put together around increasing accountability to the beneficiary and trying to get the organization to actually make it part of every decision and strategy that we are seeking to be accountable to the beneficiary. So it's a great thing. One of the leaders, the iconic people in World Vision, is an Indian gentleman who's written a book about transformational development. This was exactly his hard issue, but nobody had talked to him. So this issue comes up in front of 350 people, and he's surprised by it. So what's he do? Perfectly innocently, he didn't oppose it. He stood up and he asked some questions about how does this work. Of course he's going to ask those questions. He thinks more about this than anybody else in the organization. Simple questions. How is this mechanism really, is this really the best thing and how's it going to happen? 350 people got the message. He doesn't like it. And he got voted down. It was a slam dunk issue. Everyone thought, of course he's going to support it. But no one showed him the courtesy. These sorts of issues happen in our field every day. They happen outside the organization and inside the organization. And I think that my hope is that maybe with some of these tools and just reflecting, it might make the conversation richer for you, and I hope it does. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
For that fabulous and very engaging and informative presentation. My name is Meredith Gruber. I'm the past president of MIN, and I want to welcome you here tonight and thank you for coming out. Thank you, Heather, for dealing with the internet issues, the computer issues, and to the organizational team in the back. We have some refreshments for you and also an evaluation. We'd love for you to stay, enjoy your time together, network. I hope you'll be a little bit available for more questions offline. I also want to encourage you all to sign up for MIN, get on our listserv if you aren't already, and come out for our happy hour that's occurring in May, and look for news about our upcoming conference this October. So thank you and have a great evening.